My mother-in-law told me I was a dead end because I couldn't give her a grandchild, then introduced me to the pregnant maid she'd installed in my own home. She thought she'd orchestrated the perfect replacement, but she had no idea I was holding the evidence that would burn her entire empire to the ground. The silence in the dining room wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a physical weight, thick with the scent of roasted rosemary and the sharp, metallic tang of judgment. My mother-in-law, Evelyn, sat at the head of the table like a queen presiding over a court of failures. She didn't look at me directly. She didn't have to. Her gaze was fixed on the centerpiece, her perfectly manicured fingernails tapping a rhythmic staccato beat against the mahogany surface. "It's been 5 years, Clara," she said, her voice smooth as polished glass, cold as winter ice. 5 years of doctors, specialists, and that pathetic obsession with fertility clinics. At some point, one has to accept that nature has slammed the door in your face. Across from me, my husband Mark kept his eyes glued to his plate. He had been a phantom in our marriage for months, a man hollowed out by the exhaustion of our project. He didn't speak up, he didn't reach for my hand, he just pushed a piece of chicken around his plate, his jaw tight. Evelyn leaned forward, the chandelier light catching the predatory glimmer in her eyes. "You are barren, Clara. You're a dead end in this family's legacy. And honestly, it's selfish. To keep Mark tied to a void, to watch him wither away while you chase a miracle that clearly has no intention of visiting you, it's cruel." I felt the blood drain from my face, a sharp chill settling deep in my marrow. I opened my mouth to retort, to mention the private test results I hadn't shown her yet, or perhaps to ask why the burden of legacy always landed on my shoulders. But the words died in my throat. I looked at Mark, pleading for a shred of defense, a flicker of the man who had promised to stand by me through sickness and health. He didn't look up. He just sighed, a sound of resignation that shattered the last of my resolve. "I think," I whispered, my voice trembling, "that we should leave." Evelyn chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Leave? You haven't heard the best part yet. Mark and I have been discussing the future, a future that doesn't involve your medical bills or your limitations." Just as I stood up, the heavy oak door leading to the kitchen creaked open. A young girl, no older than 20, stepped into the dining room carrying a fresh carafe of water. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously toward Mark. She was Elena, the new live-in maid we'd hired only 3 months ago. As she reached the table, she stumbled, a small, involuntary gasp escaping her lips as she clutched her stomach. Evelyn stood up, her smile widening into something genuinely terrifying. She walked over to Elena, placing a proprietary hand on the girl's shoulder, and looked back at me with eyes that held the promise of an absolute, devastating victory. "You see, Clara," Evelyn whispered, "the legacy doesn't need you anymore, because tonight, I'm announcing a very different kind of miracle." The silence that followed was so absolute I could hear the erratic thumping of my own heart against my ribs. Elena stood frozen, her face flushing a deep, mortified crimson, her hands still trembling where she gripped the carafe. She wasn't looking at me, she was staring at Mark with a look of desperate, wounded confusion. Mark finally looked up. His face was a mask of strained indifference, but his eyes were darting around the room, avoiding mine, avoiding the truth, avoiding the wreckage he'd created. "What is she talking about, Mark?" My voice sounded strange, alien even to my own ears, hollowed out by the sudden, sickening realization of what was playing out in front of me. Evelyn didn't let him answer. She practically purred, her fingers digging into Elena's shoulder with a grip that looked far more like a vice than a gesture of comfort. "What she's talking about, Clara, is that Elena is carrying the heir this house has been screaming for. The heir you couldn't provide. Mark, tell your wife the news." Mark cleared his throat, the sound jagged and dry. "Clara, look, it just happened. It was a mistake. But Mom says, we've talked it over. We can't just turn away from a grandchild. I felt the room tilt on its axis. A mistake? I echoed, stepping toward them, the floor feeling like liquid beneath my feet. For 3 months, I've been injecting myself with hormones, suffering through night sweats and mood swings, sitting in waiting rooms listening to couples cry, and all the while you were, what, building a secret life in the maids' quarters? It's not like that, Mark stammered, finally standing up, though he didn't move toward me. He looked weak, pathetic in his desperation. Oh, it is exactly like that, Evelyn interjected, stepping between us like a battlefield commander. Elena is young, she's healthy, and she's already proven she's capable of fulfilling her primary function. We've already contacted an attorney to handle the transition. You'll be served with divorce papers by morning. Consider the house, the savings, and the legacy entirely out of your reach. Elena finally spoke, her voice a tiny, jagged splinter of sound. I didn't want this, Mrs. Sterling. You said you'd help me get into school. You said this was just a way to ensure my future. My stomach turned over. This wasn't just an affair. It was a transaction. A cold-blooded, calculated scheme. I looked at Mark, the man I had defended against my own parents, the man I had built a life with, and saw nothing but a spineless puppet dancing on his mother's strings. You think you've won? I asked, my voice suddenly dropping into a low, terrifying calm that even made Evelyn pause. You think you can just discard me like an old coat? Evelyn stepped back, her smile wavering, just for a second. You have nothing, Clara. No leverage, no children, no standing. You are nobody. I turned toward the door, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I reached the threshold and stopped, turning back to see them all, the smug matriarch, the cowering husband, and the terrified girl. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope I had received from my private investigator only an hour before the dinner started. The one I hadn't yet had the courage to open. You're right, Evelyn, I said, a dark, jagged smile spreading across my face as I tore the envelope open. I don't have a child, but I have something much, much more interesting. I pulled out a stack of grainy, date-stamped photographs and laid them on the sideboard. As Evelyn stepped forward to look at them, her face went from triumphant to deathly pale, and I knew the ground beneath their feet was about to give way. I didn't hire a doctor to check my fertility, I said, watching the blood drain from Mark's face as he caught a glimpse of the top image. I hired someone to check what you were really doing with the family's offshore accounts while you were busy building my legacy. The photograph wasn't just a picture. It was a map of their undoing. Evelyn's hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers hovering over a grainy image of a signature that belonged to her, affixed to a document authorizing the transfer of millions into a shell company that didn't exist. She had been bleeding the family estate dry for years, laundering the money to cover her gambling debts and the exorbitant lifestyle she curated to maintain the Sterling illusion. Mark's face lost all its color, his eyes widening as he recognized the logo on the ledger in the second photo. Mom? What is this? What is she talking about? Shut up, Mark, Evelyn shrieked, the veneer of aristocratic grace shattering completely. She lunged for the photos, but I was faster, snatching them back and tucking them into my blazer with a cold, deliberate precision. The best part isn't even the fraud, I continued, my voice steady, cutting through the sudden hysteria in the room. The best part is that I sent a duplicate of this entire file to the district attorney's office exactly 20 minutes ago. It's sitting on a desk in the city, waiting for a morning briefing. The silence returned, but this time, it was suffocating. Elena, caught in the middle of a war she hadn't realized was being fought with high-stakes indictments, began to cry. She looked at Evelyn, the woman who had promised her a future, and saw the true monster behind the pearls. You promised me, Elena sobbed, her voice trembling. You said there were no risks. You said the baby would be enough to keep the police away from the accounts. Mark's head snapped toward his mother, his betrayal turning into a volatile cocktail of rage and confusion. The police? You involved the maid in a money laundering scheme? You used her pregnancy as a distraction for an audit? It was meant to be leverage, Evelyn spat, her eyes darting between me and the door. If I had a grandchild, if I had a new generation of Sterling, the courts would have looked the other way. We would have been a dynasty again. I walked toward the kitchen door, the heavy brass knob cold against my palm. I stopped and looked over my shoulder, taking in the scene. The crumbling matriarch, the panicked husband, and the girl who was now the primary witness to a felony that would land them all in prison for decades. You wanted an heir, Evelyn, I said, my voice dripping with ice. You wanted someone to carry on the Sterling name. Well, you got your wish. But the only thing they're going to inherit is a legacy of shackles and a prison visitation schedule. Clara, wait, Mark shouted, stepping forward, his hands outstretched in a futile, desperate plea. We can fix this. Just take the photos back. We can share the money. We can make this go away. The only thing going away, Mark, is you, I replied. I stepped into the hallway, pulling the heavy door shut behind me, effectively sealing them inside their own private hell. I could hear Evelyn screaming, a high, piercing sound of a woman watching her life's work disintegrate, followed by the sound of glass shattering as she threw the carafe against the wall. I walked toward the front entrance, my heart racing, knowing that I had just burned the bridge to my old life. I reached the front door and pushed it open, stepping out into the cool, crisp night air. I breathed in deeply, savoring the feeling of freedom. But as I reached for my car keys, a pair of headlights flickered on from the end of the long, gravel driveway. A black sedan, unmarked and menacing, began to pull slowly toward the house, its engine purring like a predator. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. As the car rolled closer, the window lowered, and I saw a man in a dark suit looking straight at me, not at the house, but at me. He held up a file, identical in size and shape to the one I had just exposed, and tapped it against the glass. "Mrs. Sterling," he called out, his voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. "We were wondering when you'd finally decide to cooperate. But you really shouldn't have involved the girl. She's not who you think she is." The man stepped out of the sedan, the gravel crunching beneath his polished shoes, with a sound like snapping bone. He didn't look like a cop, and he certainly didn't look like an attorney. He had the aura of a man who dealt in permanent solutions. "Elena isn't just a maid, Clara," he said, holding the file aloft. "She's the daughter of a hedge fund manager whose career your mother-in-law systematically dismantled 6 years ago. She didn't stumble into this house by accident. She's been waiting for the exact moment the Sterlings felt untouchable, so she could document every single cent of their greed." My knees felt weak. I had thought I was the mastermind, the scorned wife wielding the sword of justice. But I realized then that I was merely a pawn in a much darker game. "Why tell me?" I managed to ask, my pulse thrumming in my ears. "Because you were the wild card," he replied, sliding the file across the hood of the car. "The Sterlings needed you to be barren, and they needed you to be quiet. But they underestimated your rage. We didn't need to plant the evidence. We just needed you to find it. You did the heavy lifting for us." Behind me, the front door of the mansion swung open. Mark stumbled out, his face white as a sheet, his phone pressed to his ear. He saw me, saw the man in the dark suit, and stopped dead. "Clara? Who is that? The police are on their way. I called them. I told them it was all Mom's doing." Mark was trying to cut a deal, willing to toss his own mother to the wolves to save his skin. It was the final, pathetic act of a coward. The man in the suit ignored him entirely, nodding toward me. "The documents in that file aren't just for the DA, Clara. They're for the IRS, the SEC, and the FBI. Once you hand those over, your involvement in the Sterling estate ends. You walk away with nothing, but you walk away clean. If you stay, you'll be indicted as an accomplice to their decade of fraud. I looked at the house one last time. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her hair disheveled, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She saw the man, then she saw me, and she finally understood. The game wasn't just over. It was rigged from the start. "Clara!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Don't you dare! You're a Sterling! You're a part of this." "I was never a Sterling," I said, my voice cold and clear, echoing in the vast, empty driveway. "I was just a woman you underestimated." I grabbed the file from the hood of the car, turned my back on the mansion, and walked toward the sedan. I didn't look back at Mark's pathetic sobbing or Evelyn's frantic, collapsing world. As I climbed into the passenger seat, the man in the suit pulled away, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust that swallowed the house whole. The next morning, the news cycles were dominated by the Sterling collapse. By noon, the estate was surrounded by federal agents, and the headlines screamed of the mother-son fraud syndicate. Elena, the maid, had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a series of sworn statements that would ensure the Sterling name was scrubbed from polite society forever. I sat in a small, nondescript apartment 3 states away, watching the sunset through a window that didn't look out over a manicured garden. I was broke. I was technically a person of interest in a massive federal investigation, and I was entirely alone. But as I poured a glass of wine and listened to the silence, true, peaceful, honest silence, I smiled. I wasn't a mother, and I wasn't a wife, and I certainly wasn't a Sterling. For the first time in 5 years, I was just me. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough.